And the meeting, as I said, is supposed to be, I think it's online, the Philosophy Club, although they want to meet in person. I don't know when that's going to start, but you can meet in person, but they want to meet outside at the that overlook. What's it called? The overlook. You know what I'm talking about? It's on this side of campus, and it's looking out over the ocean. It's the best spot on campus. It's got like a little auditorium kind of thing on this side of campus. Yeah. It's the best spot on the campus, and let's use some logic here. This is one of the best campuses in the state, in the city. This is one of the best cities in the world, which means the spot where we would intend to have the philosophy clubs meetings is one of the best spots in the world. Is that logic flawed in any way? It is not. We don't have time to discuss it any beyond that. Just accept it. And don't lose sight of how amazing this place is. All right, and by amazing, what do I mean? Let's see if I can avoid ambiguity and cliche. The readings for today, George Orwell's Politics and the English Language. And then we'll talk about ambiguity, we'll talk about cliche. Paul Herrick, to remind us from last time's reading, discusses ambiguity and vagueness. It's a good review, page 58. Make note of that in your notes when you want to go back over ambiguity and vagueness. It's only a paragraph or two. He also talks about verbal versus factual disagreement. That's page 59. I'm actually going to start with that distinction. Verbal versus factual disputes. Most of the disputes that we're going to be interested in the next couple of weeks is going to be about verbal disputes. Confusion over language. Two different kinds of confusion. This is not clear what I've written here because I was doing it quickly earlier. We can be confused in our language based on ambiguity, and there are two different kinds of ambiguity, semantic and syntactic ambiguity. And each of those kinds of ambiguity has their own error in reasoning. When I'm engaged in semantic ambiguity in an argument, I engage in what's known as the fallacy of equivocation. If I'm engaged in syntactic ambiguity in an argument, that's called amphiboly. I'll describe both of those today. And then you can also be mistaken, confused in language based on vagueness. Is Metallica coming to concert? There was somebody with another Metallica shirt on just earlier today. What are the chances? Huh?
I'm not sure.
Just coincidental. That's curious. And I came up with it. I didn't come up with it. I found a meme online that said, that referenced Metallica. This seems too coincidental. The meme was something like, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." And it says it's a quote from Bob Dylan, drummer of Metallica. And then it was a picture of Prince. It was brilliant. But Metallica was mentioned, I've seen it 3 times in his few days. Something in the universe is saying something.
Maybe you should go to a concert.
I should. I haven't been to a concert in, I don't remember. Alt J and Portugal the Man. It's a great, Portugal, period, the Man. They're coming. I think that's how they want to be called. Portugal the Man will be coming to the Santa Barbara Bowl next year in the March. So that would be fun to go to. All right, let's move on. What are the two kinds of disputes I already mentioned? There's linguistic disputes, verbal disputes, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Disagreement over the use or meaning of language. And remember, this ties in nicely with what we discussed with Wittgenstein. He somewhat too categorically claims, all philosophical problems can be alleviated, resolved, dissolved, if we simply clarify our language. That's too strong, I think, but nevertheless, he's certainly correct that a lot of errors in reasoning come about because of confused language, lack of clarity in what we mean. For instance, let's imagine Ned says, waterboarding is torture and should not be used. But then Ed comes in and says, no, indeed, it's merely an enhanced interrogation technique, and you can't tell me there's anything wrong with that. If so, we would have to ban country music in Texas. I'm not sure I added that last point, other than to get another jab at Texas. I lived there for many years, so that's acceptable. I apologize if you're from Texas. I am going to continually berate the state. Anyone here from Texas? Now that I said that, probably should have asked that first.
Did you ever get an accent living there?
No, I apparently worked really hard on avoiding that accent. I'm from Pennsylvania originally. My mom's from Illinois. You get your accent from your mom. So I'm told I have a Midwestern accent, which I was surprised about. Because, of course, you don't think you have an accent. But you do. All right, so to other people. What does enhanced interrogation technique mean? Enhanced. That's vague. It's better? It's more? It's like a commercial. Now with more water? I don't know what waterboarding would be in the sense of enhanced. It's unclear. The definition of what waterboarding is, the definition of torture is what is at issue here. The meaning of those terms. How do we analyze conceptually what they mean? That's the dispute in this particular case. It's not whether something happened or didn't happen. That's easy for the most part. Well, Herrick mentions this, as I said, on page 59. The distinction between verbal and factual disputes. Here's another example. Ned says the U.S. has not used waterboarding on detainees. General Hayden said, however, according to Ed, that we used it on 3 different individuals. Notice the dispute isn't between these 2 individuals, is not about word meaning. It's about whether something happened or not. It's about what are the state of affairs. What has happened? What are the facts? Now, you can combine these, and this is usually what happens, and you have a dispute that's both verbal and factual, in the sense that there's disputes over what happened and what the words at issue in the arguments mean. The dispute happens when another person comes in and tries to, but fails in some way, accurately interpret what the initial person said. Or they talk past each other and are even unaware of the fact that they're talking past each other. And so here's the complexity. The disputes you can get into can be verbal, and they can be verbally a dispute because of confusion of ambiguity. But it can be 2 kinds of ambiguity. It could be semantic and syntactic ambiguity in the same dispute. There can also be vagueness as a problem linguistically, verbally. All in the same argument. And so we'll see how we can look for this in debates as we go forward. There's also a marital dispute. This is a bit of a joke, but not really. It relates to what we're going to talk about today. Years ago, my wife bought a ficus plant and asked me, "What do you think of the ficus plant?" And I said, "It's all right." And she was dumbfounded. "Just all right?" And then she said, "I think I love that ficus plant more than you." To which I said, "Well, why don't you go and marry it then?" Do you see what's happened here? And there's more to the story. She did. Now lives in Houston with Fred. She named the ficus plant Fred. Can you believe that? So here, the fallacy of amphibole, which I haven't defined yet, can wreck a marriage. Why is that? What's gone wrong? If you are a disinterested third-party observer watching this, maybe this was at a coffee shop and you overheard it, and then I said, "We're going to remodel our house." To go back to that earlier stupidity. What would you say? How would you fix this? Where's the confusion? There's ambiguity. Where's the ambiguity? And who's at fault? That's really what I want to know. Because this really did happen, except for the Fred and Fike. I told you I'd come back to Fred. Remember the picture? I was pointing to Bruce Deuce, the blue spruce. And then I said a picture of Fred, and I said that's foreshadowing. Here's Fred. Yes?
So would the ambiguity be when you say, "Well, why don't you marry it then?" in response to your wife saying, "I love the ficus plant more than you," because obviously, like, the mix-up is like, you can still like a plant, but that doesn't mean to marry it. Or like most people will marry it, but...
Love your plants. Just don't love your plants. There's a bit about Louis C.K. in there I'm not going to get into right now. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Let's skip that. Look it up if you want. Not quite. But that is true. But where's the mistake here? Yeah.
The third premise or statement where
Well, let's just do this.
she lives in Houston.
Oh. Why would that... Is there lack of clarity there?
Well-
Because if she took the ficus and moved to Houston, that part's not true. That didn't happen. She didn't name the ficus Fred, and she didn't leave me to go to Houston and live with the plant. But you're saying there's some clarity.
We don't know who Fred is.
It's the ficus plant in this story.
But it doesn't say that previously.
Oh, right. Right, it says it after.
So that's why.
I see. Okay, yes, that's fair, but that's not where the ambiguity in the confusion is, though.
Isn't it, and when she says more than you, but that doesn't really imply that, it doesn't imply like marriage, it's just saying she loves it more than you? I don't know.
She prefers the plant more than she prefers me. That's one interpretation, and that's how I took it. But where's another interpretation of that?
Oh, well, I was going to say that ambiguity was in the I love, because she hasn't specified what type of love it is.
Oh, there's that too. It's merely agape. It's the kind of love that filial piety and other... No. That's relevant. But that's not what led me to then say, why don't you marry it? Do you see? Oh, I've forgotten the order. 1, 2, and then 3, yes?
Is that like, in terms of liking, like she likes the plant more than you do?
Yes! She likes the plant more than I like the plant. Not she likes the plant more than she likes me. And I didn't read it that way. Of course I did. I was joking. I think I like this plant more than you. I could have been a Wittgensteinian arrogant ass and say, do you mean to say you like the plant more than I like the plant? I'd be an ass then. Instead, I made a joke. Why don't you marry it? Acting more childish than perhaps was necessary. So we clarify the ambiguity by saying, I think I love that ficus plant more than you like that ficus plant. That's where the confusion was. Anyway, more on amphibole later. There's Eric Arthur Blair, George Orwell. People had the darndest mustaches back in that period, didn't they? 1945. We'll see another person with a mustache similar to that. A little bit shorter, though.
His
Middle.
top lip's basically gone.
I'm sorry?
I just said his top lip is basically gone. Like,
Well,
You see his body.
He's shaking.
covered by the mustache.
That's the bottom. Here's his bottom. I don't need to analyze this really. There's ambiguity in this picture. Where's his face? Looks like a caterpillar is running across his mouth. Sorry. That's an ad hominem right there. I can't agree with anything he says because look at his face. This is a text that is relevant to today. He is concerned with the language that we use, the clarity or lack of clarity in it. He's concerned that we are merely getting habituated to cough up prefabricated phrases. And what do we do when we cough up prefabricated phrases? We call them cliches today. Overworn phrases that may have been interesting and even wise when they were initially coined. There's a great description of cliché by the philosopher Gilles Deleuze. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. The cliché is wisdom. No. Shoot. I've forgotten. Oh, it's a brilliant one too. Nonsense masquerading as wisdom? I think it's that. Oh, I've forgotten it. Anyway, it's a borrowed phrase. It's what I would call a thought crutch. It stands in for thinking. I don't have to ponder things if I've got prefabricated phrases that I can spit out in the appropriate general context. Orwell's very concerned about that because he sees the use of language. Think about when he's writing, around the same time as Susan Stebbing. Stebbing writes before the World War II. The reading we have is right before World War II. His in 1945 is right at the end. He's aware of what came out of the Ministry of Propaganda, which is aptly named. The Nazis actually had a ministry that they labeled propaganda. What do you do there? We engage in propaganda. What's that? We basically tell lies. We engage in psychological warfare. We engage in disinformation. And they were honest about that, which is weird. In fact, Stalin then took on this role, but didn't label the ministries in his regime as propagandistic. In fact, Stalin coined a term. He stipulated that the word disinformation, which he gave it a faux French etymology, desinformación, I don't know how to, that's actually sounded Spanish or the French, but he actually coined this term. It's a fascinating story. And gave it a French etymology so that it would appear it had Western origins and didn't come from Soviet Russia. And here's a case in which you can say, and this is the only case in which you can use this cliche, the word desinformación at that moment, when he coined it, you could say of it that it is what it is, a piece of disinformation. Beyond those very rare situations, don't ever use the phrase, it is what it is. Because what are you doing when you say, it is what it is? And when do you use that? We've talked about this before. And here we'll see why. Blair would call this, Orwell would call this, and others too, empty consolation. What do you do when somebody's suffering horribly? And something bad has happened to them. And you want to say something. And so you end up not knowing what to say, so you rely upon things that you don't even know what it means. Have you ever said something that's a cliche, that's a slogan, that's a common phrase, but you haven't realized what it actually means? This is what Orwell's concerned with. He's concerned that we lack, and Wittgenstein had this problem too, and we'll see him again with Harry Frankfurt and his work on bullshit. But a lot of what Orwell is saying here is very much similar to what we'll see with Harry Frankfurt later on. I have the word bullshit written all over the place. Not in the sense of, I don't believe what the guy's saying, but I'm saying, wow, your conception there, that lack of concern for what words mean and how they affect our world and our actions and our thinking is very much like what Frankfurt's going to call bullshit. He starts with, I didn't number the pages, I apologize, there are 8 pages, so I just added a number here. Page 1, second full paragraph. Now, it is clear, says Orwell, that the decline of, oh, you know what, let's stop there. It is clear. What's wrong with that? I'm nitpicking here, but I'm doing so because the point of this text is to be clear, concise. Yes?
We don't know what's clear.
Well, I didn't finish reading, I guess, so that wasn't very good. My bad. Okay, I'll give you the quote. Now it is clear that the decline of a language must ultimately have political and economic causes. The phrase, it is clear, is similar to, it's obvious. If it's obvious, why state it? Why state the obvious? Now, this sounds like a total nitpick, but don't use the word or phrase, it is obvious. I would avoid even saying, it's clear in your arguments, especially if that's part of your premises, because as we'll see, that's a rhetorical device. It's a kind of trick. It's a proof surrogate. It's standing in the place of an actual argument. How do I know this conclusion is true? Because it's clear. It says that right there. It's clear. But what if I disagree? And my disagreement is in the form of, what you just said is false. And you ask me why? Because it's obvious. That's not doing anything. That's not doing any of the work for the proof of the claim. But let's go on. It is not due simply to the bad influence of this or that individual writer, but an effect can become a cause, reinforcing the original cause and producing the same effect in an intensified form, and so on indefinitely. A man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure, and then fail all the more completely because he drinks. That's a nice analogy. We'll see. Is it apt? It is rather the same thing. We might say a similar thing, that is happening to the English language. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish. But the slovenliness, a great word, the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. The point is that the process is reversible. Modern English, especially written English, is full of bad habits which spread by imitation, perhaps akin to memes today, and which can be avoided if one is willing to take the necessary trouble. If one gets rid of these habits, one can think more clearly, and to think clearly is a necessary step toward political regeneration. He's not just saying we need to be clear in our language, in our essays, in our writing, because that's important for communication. But we change how politics works. We change how the social world works. It's not quibbling over language. It's not quibbling over semantics. It all just is semantics. And that's something we saw with Wittgenstein as well. And what happens when we speak in cliches, in these empty slogans? As he says on page 4, and then on the top of 5. As I have tried to show, modern writing is, at its worst, does not consist in picking out words for the sake of their meaning and inventing images in order to make the meaning clearer. It consists in gumming together long strips of words which have already been set in order by someone else. That's the cliche. That's the slogan. That's the everything happens for a reason. It is what it is. That's empty consolation. You don't even know what you mean when you say those things. If you want to give somebody and express empathy for them, with them, compassion, which means to suffer with them, don't give them empty cliches. Don't say anything. Just stand there and say, I don't know what you're going through. I can't imagine it. It's awful. I'm here for you. Don't. You can even add, I don't know what to say. Words, I'm sorry, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you. That's not cliche. I guess it could be deemed as such, but that's better than throwing out, vomiting out these verbal thought crutches that have come up by somebody else. As he continues, they're set in order by someone else, and making the results presentable by sheer humbug. Coincidentally, this term humbug is not a common used term in the U.S., but it's a term that Harry Frankfurt, who we'll look at later, compares to bullshit. And for Frankfurt, bullshit is a lack of concern for truth, a lack of concern for what reality is. The attraction of this way of writing is that it is easy. It's easier, even quicker, once you have a habit. To say, for instance, in my opinion, it is not an unjustifiable assumption that, rather than to just say, I think. Now that doesn't seem like a very big deal. That seems trivial. We can use fewer words. We should use fewer words. That's not what he's saying. It's not just what he's saying. The great enemy, he says, of clear language is insincerity. I think there bullshit plays a role. I'm just saying things without really worried about what I mean. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, or cliches, like a cuttlefish spurting out ink. Here you have a battle between, I tried to visualize this for us, an octopus and a squid. I'm sorry, a cuttlefish, which I don't know what a cuttlefish is, but it's that.
Between the two.
What is it?
It's between the two. It's a badass little creature.
Yeah.
Imagine like an alien squid thing. Imagine Davy Jones's head.
Davy Jones.
From Pirates of the Caribbean. Someone chopped it off and put it in the water. That's a cuttlefish. It's
What?
got a big lobe, like these big eyes, and then all this little like a beard of tentacles.
Oh, that freaks me out, man.
And they transform colors like insane. And they fight each other when they mate. It's actually really cool.
Oh, you sure they're fighting and not just cuddling?
Sorry. It's
Because the cuddle. Oh, it's cuttle, not cuttlefish. I was playing on word. That's a pun. So, what does the ink do? And what's the analogy? It's like a diversion, right? And it blinds us. It's just spewing out. It's like it's a verbal vomit, where I'm not thinking about what it is I'm saying because I don't have to. It's easier to just spit out cliches. It's easier to just throw out a meme that I don't even understand the content of. This is a problem. And a lot of the problems arise, and we're going to see, with respect to meaning again. I keep returning to this. We talked about this last time with Wittgenstein. What do you mean by these words? If I get into the habit of not thinking about the words that, in a sense, are choosing me, I'm not thinking. They're not my thoughts. They're other people's. I am borrowing them without thinking of where they come from. And we see this all over. You see it in politicians who make decisions for us, on behalf of us, using language in an effort to persuade rather than convince. There's a difference. Convincing is what we do in this class and trying to show that something is or is not the case. Persuading is more of a rhetorical use of language where there's a lack of concern for what is really the case, but just an intent to persuade you that something is the way you want it to be. because it helps you, it benefits you individually.
How can you tell if someone's trying to persuade you versus convince you?
We'll have to get to that with rhetoric. The answer to that question will be on the 5th and the 7th. I'll try to answer that, and you can't always. It's good to give others the benefit of the doubt, and that they're not trying to bullshit you, they're not trying to persuade you, that they are interested in what they're saying, and that they want to get at some aspect of reality or some element of truth. There are hints, though. Are they using absolutist language? Are they using appeals to emotion? Are they interested in listening to what you have said in response? There are ways of telling whether this person's truly interested in coming to a truth or just simply trying to get you to believe what they want to be the case.
Isn't persuasion necessary sometimes though?
Yes. That's why the question on the 7th of October, rhetoric and propaganda, should they ever be used? And it's not obvious. That's a good question. If somebody's about to jump off a bridge, I don't have time to sit there and say, let me give you a syllogism. Unless it's Aristotle. Then they're like, yeah, I appreciate that. But sometimes we need a different approach. And when that time is, that's going to be a topic of our discussion with W.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke and their discussion of propaganda and rhetoric. Now, I am what I am. I'm not going to go through this. We kind of already did this a bit. What does it mean? Why do we speak this way? Again, this kind of puts off having to think about something. And I am what I am. It's a simile, or is it a metaphor? Is it an illustration of the law of identity? That's not what Popeye is doing. Popeye says this. When does Popeye say this? I am what I am. He says it to mean, I've messed up. What can I do? I am what I am. Do you know what I'm talking about? Oh.
Popeye's old.
He's the guy with the arms. This South Park did a great homage to Popeye, where finally Popeye went to the doctor, and the doctor's like, you are terribly unhealthy. Your arms are not supposed to look like that. It's very funny. I think that was the episode I was watching with my son when he was far too young to be watching South Park. But I was laughing hysterically the whole time. Anyway, I've done something wrong. Well, I am who I am. You can't change me. Yeah, I did that, but what do you expect? That's my nature. It can't be changed. It's a kind of dismissal of responsibility. Well, why did you do that? You haven't answered the question by saying, well, it's because that's who I am. What does that mean? That doesn't answer it. It's like saying, it is what it is. It's a similar kind of deflection of thought, a verbal crutch that doesn't require us to actually, as Orwell puts it, come up with a way of describing what's in our heads and being responsible for the thoughts that come out in the words we use. When we use cliches, we're using other people's words, and we don't even know what the thoughts are that are associated with them. Now, this isn't always the case. This is difficult, because sometimes phrases become cliches. And when something that is a pocket of wisdom and is interesting and relevant becomes a cliche because of overuse, it's not obvious. Nobody said to Lao Tzu when he first opened the opening lines of Tao Te Ching, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. Nobody said to him, that's a cliche, Lao Tzu. You can do better. No, nobody had said that before. But now, too many people say it, right? And it becomes cliche. And it stands in the place of actually having to think, right? Okay, so on we go. What happens, though? And here's where Orwell is concerned. Here's the politics. Here's the economics. What was the other term he used? Of how language is degenerating. It matters, the words we use. And in politics now, we oftentimes talk about slanters. And a kind of slanter is a euphemism. And you've seen euphemisms. Euphemisms are very common. The root EU means good. It's found in neutral as well. And neutralization, as we'll see. To give or offer a euphemism is to give a positive or a neutral slant on something that would otherwise be unpleasant. Even though you're referring the referent to our discussion last week. The referent is the very same. There's so many ways of firing somebody. And we use euphemisms. I mean, maybe you've had to fire. I've never actually fired anyone. I've never been in a position to be able to do so. But if you had to, maybe some of you have. Did you use, or maybe some of you have been fired. You don't have to tell us, but if you want to, what was the phrase that was used? You're canned. You're out of here. We've downsized your position. We're going to have to let you go, which is kind of nice because it sounds like you were really struggling to hold on and then they let you go, and that's good. Or you've been promoted to customer, which is a good one too. That's a positive spin on something terrible. But they're all referring to the same thing, you not working here anymore. Same referent, different senses. You being fired sounds different than we're going to let you go. Why is that relevant? We'll get to this more with Aristotle, but Plato and Aristotle with our discussion of rhetoric later. Orwell tells us political language has to consist largely of euphemism, question begging, and we'll see what that means again later. That means unargued for presumptions in this context. Question begging and sheer cloudy vagueness. Oh boy, what do we say to this? What's wrong, Orwell? What have you done? Cloudy vagueness. If we're being nitpicking again, what would we tell Orwell?
I don't know if it's called a double negative, but it's like he's kind of like used two words unnecessarily. Like he could have gone either way with it. It's
Cloudy vagueness. He's being redundant,
redundant.
which is what he tells us not to do. Get rid of unnecessary words. Well, cloudy is unnecessary if you've already got vague. It basically, as we'll see next class, mean the same thing. Yeah.
In the reading, he sort of accepts that he's probably been it like 100 times already.
Yes, he does say that at the end. Instead of going back over it to fix it, he says, I probably made these mistakes many, many times. I thought that was interesting. Which tells us something. He's telling us we need to be cautious with our language, but even those who are very, very cautious find it difficult to succeed. Russell will say something similar with respect to vagueness. Our goal is to be as precise as we can with our language, knowing we will never, ever be 100% precise, because it's impossible with any kind of representational system. And language is a representational system. There's a bunch of other examples of euphemisms. If you're selling a car, you don't go to a used car lot. I don't think they have those anymore. You go to get a car that's certified pre-owned, which sounds better than used. And vintage clothes rather than used and old. Vintage means, I don't know exactly what it means. Just basically means used and old. Maybe that's kept up nicely. Neutralized, that sounds better than assassinated. You are neutralizing the target. The politician, the head of state was neutralized. Certainly sounds better than this word that has two cuss words in it. Do you see that? Assass? It's a really weird word. Assassination. My kids will love that one. I'm going to have to go home today and tell them that one. Civilian casualties or collateral damage. This happened not too long ago in Afghanistan. Before we left, there was a drone strike, and we did not hit our target. We hit, I think it was a wedding party or a party of some sort. Innocents were killed.
No.
No? They weren't killed?
No, the innocents were killed. It wasn't a wedding.
Oh, what was it?
The New York Times did a really good article on it, but it was basically just a guy who was coming home from work, who's a father, and a bunch of his kids.
So, what do we say? What's an apt description of that? We can give the details, or we can say, it was collateral damage. It's understandable sometimes to use euphemisms. If I have a list of other words that have the root good, eureka, good discovery, neutral, euthanasia literally means good death, euthanasia. Eulogy means good speech. I guess you can give a eulogy at a funeral where somebody was euthanized. But that's awful. Sometimes the euphemism's fine, right? What happened to them? Well, they passed away. We don't need to attack that person there. It depends on the context and what we're doing. Are we trying to hide something? Are we trying to make something seem less horrible than it really is? And by the way, collateral damage, the euphemism for civilian casualties, became so synonymous with something horrible that I believe there was a euphemism on top of that. A euphemism for the euphemism. But I can't find it. Do you know what it is? Oh, if you can find it, that would be awesome.
I think they used the word righteous strike.
Oh, that sounds terrible. I'll have to look into that. If that is now the new euphemism for collateral damage, I don't know what Orwell would be. Orwell would be turning over in his grave if he didn't hate cliches so much.
It was today's New York Times article.
Oh.
So it's the podcast, the daily.
Okay.
So it's like 16 minutes.
I'll have to look. Well, I don't have that much time.
I was gonna ask, what does collateral damage mean? Like, I know what collateral is, but.
So we need to blow up this. We need to demolish this building, and we do so. And this building on the side of it got damaged. That wasn't the intention, but that's what happened as a result of our actions. And that's certainly better morally, I think we could say, than intentionally attacking civilians. No doubt, we can make that. We can avoid that moral equivalency. However, we are attempting, as Orwell will tell us, to change the perspectives of those listening because it has a different sense. Civilian casualties, accidentally killing a family with children sounds different, even though the reference is the same.
Yeah, I was thinking about like even the ones that aren't like harmful per se, like I think they do have like an effect on our like societal outlooks on certain topics, like death. People are kind of freaked out about death, so like euthanasia makes it. Or like.
Well, to euthanize a pet is to put it down, for example.
Yeah, and then like passing away is like separating ourselves from the topic of what's actually happening.
Yes.
Regardless.
I think that's right. I think the way we talk about death now, very different than the way even 100 years ago in the United States that we talked about death. The language is different. Read Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. The way that they described death and experienced it in the household. Now we immediately remove the person, get them into a hospital, get them into a morgue, and we're distant from them. In the past, death was around us a lot. Guess what? Death is still around us. And maybe it's best that we don't see it all the time. But notice how it changes the way we think. For Orwell's point here, the language that we use changes the way we think. And the way we think changes the language. It's a two-way causal interactionism.
I'm wondering what you think about this. It's difficult, right? The idea of there being no such thing as like a non-euphemism, and that all language being slanted language, and there's merely just like.
So there are dysphemisms, so that's not euphemism.
Oh well.
But it still has a slant. Is that
So,
you?
yeah,
I
so,
see.
Slanted language then. That all language is slanted, and there's simply there are terms that more people would agree with, and we could label those as more objective maybe, but they could never be really objective or
Good.
neutral.
Probably. And in the context, it may be difficult to establish which is the most objective, cognitively speaking.
Because like for the drone strike example, like people could call that terrorism, and
That's
I'm sure
right.
a lot of people would agree with that, but people could also call it collateral damage, and I think a lot of people in America especially would agree with that.
One man's invasion is another man's expansion, to quote the lead singer from the band Riboflavin. Which is my old band, so nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about there. But that is a quote from our singer. One man's expansion is not, unless maybe he got it from somewhere else. I don't know. But yes, from the perspective, right? This is an invasion. That's the right term to use. No, it isn't. We're just annexing the Sudetenland. What? What does annexing the Sudetenland mean? You're taking that land, and you're playing a role in causing World War II. Hitler, for example. Very good point. It's difficult. Let me get the order here. 1 and then 2. Yes.
So just for like an example, if you're talking about like undocumented immigrants,
There's that too.
and
Yes.
you say like illegal aliens,
Yes.
like would that be this or would that be a euphemism? Because even though you're putting a positive spin on your actions, you're putting a negative spin on the word illegal alien.
So if you call somebody an illegal alien, that's a dysphemism. And it may be a category mistake.
But wouldn't you?
And it may be confusion because alien is not a term that's typically used for people. It's used for extraterrestrials. And illegal is rare to use. I don't know any other context. I guess you can call somebody a burglar, but you wouldn't call them illegal. An action is illegal. An activity is against the law. But a person being illegal seems logically problematic. It's semantically problematic. Orwell, I think, would find this problematic. He would have a field day with that one, to use some more unclear language. But did that help?
But like
like, could the phrasing still be like a euphemism because you're putting a positive spin on your actions, even though the word used is negative? Like, could it be both, you know? Like, 'cause you're-
Positive and negative at the same time? I don't, what's the positive spin there?
like, you're making your actions sound more justifiable. But
Which by calling,
by saying, like, deporting illegal aliens, like, you're making...
oh, I got you. I didn't know which direction. Yes, in that sense, you're using a dysphemism to justify your removal of them, for example. Yes, I think that is using a dysphemism against the person. Again, I may be begging the question. Maybe it is the right word to say. Maybe we should be calling people illegal. That would require an argument. As it stands, it seems like it's a category mistake of confusing semantics and what words and how words refer to states of affairs, actions versus people. That's a very good question. It's tough. I forgot who was.
I was just going
and
to
then-
ask, why do you think so many parents use euphemisms when they're raising a child rather than saying things how they are and like sugarcoating them so much?
Yeah, who was asking, should we be able to use persuasion? Who was asking that earlier? Is it sometimes necessary to persuade? Is it sometimes necessary to use euphemism? I think probably. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do when I have to have that talk with my son about the birds and the bees. I mean, I'm not an entomologist, but I don't think birds and bees can even mate. What the hell kind of conversation am I going to... That's obviously not how I'm going to start it. Or maybe it will be. Maybe that's how I'll start to get him laughing and then say, okay, now this is what happens. Oh, it's going to be awful. But I got to beat him to it. I got to beat the internet. I can't let the internet do it for me. Just thinking out loud here. I'll probably use euphemisms. I probably will. I'm going to say, son, I'm not going to be speaking directly to you. Let's move on. Okay. Was there another hand I saw? I apologize.
No, it was just a comment, so it was that too.
Okay. So there's dysphemisms as well. And we'll talk more about this with rhetoric, as I said. In fact, this specific case, there's a link here to see what the death tax is. But look, if I'm trying to lower or increase the tax rate, I want to raise taxes. I'm going to call it an estate tax. If I want to lower taxes, I'm going to refer to that same thing as a death tax. Because estate sounds wealthy. As Frank Luntz, the pollster and guru of how words work, he has a book called How Words That Work, and he uses his technique to help politicians. In fact, he coined the term death tax, as we'll see next time, in a couple sessions. But if I call it an estate tax, I don't really know what that means. And it sounds wealthy. And it turns out, if you look into it, it is. If I have an estate worth over $10 million, and I'm going to bequeath it to my children, then that estate gets taxed at a pretty high rate. But only after that 10 million. Everything over 10 million gets taxed at a high rate, like 50%. But not before that. And unless I have an estate worth $10 million or more, that doesn't apply to me. But when you call it a death tax, it sounds like it applies to everyone and equally. And nobody wants to be taxed when they die. That's a dysphemism. And it plays a role in what happens. It plays a role in changing policy because it changes how people perceive things. It's persuasive. As Orwell says, page 6, if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should know better. We might include him, perhaps, but we've already talked about that. What's a bad usage? We'll see some more examples as we go. So we can have euphemisms, we can have dysphemisms. Maybe we can't avoid it completely, because all language is kind of valenced one way or another. There's no purely neutral language, purely cognitive, if you will. I gave the example of this before. If I'm running for office, do I call myself a bureaucrat, government official, or a public servant? It's pretty obvious. But they all have the same referent. Different senses. Government official has a different sense, a different connotation. What pops into your head is going to be different than if you hear bureaucrat, which has a negative connotation. And yet the referent, the thing we're pointing to, public servant, that points to the same thing, but public servant certainly sounds great. My opponent somehow is a bureaucrat, but I'm a public servant. Global warming was the phrase that was very common until around 2000. And then Frank Luntz, one dude, changed that. Whether or not it's for better or worse, I leave that open. But we didn't call it global warming. In fact, there was a memo that was released around this time where he focus grouped this term. He checked to see. He polled it. Global warming sounds ominous and dangerous. But climate change just sounds like the weather's changed. It's warmer today than yesterday. And that didn't have as ominous a ring. And he convinced enough people to change what they said and how they said it. Others have argued we ought to call it global weirding because it's having weird effects on the environment. Yes, the temperatures are rising, but it's unclear what that means. And it's easily refuted, and I put refuted in quotes. I'll get to this downplayer in a moment. It's easily refuted when there's a cold day that is unexpected. You're telling me global warming's a thing? Why is it snowing now? Here at this particular point, at this particular time. Global warming doesn't mean that snow is going to go away completely. It means that the environment is negatively affected and in a considerable way. Globally. Not locally or not only locally. We talked about this, of course, with our paper, with our discussion of what is truth in the text by Weatherall and Galen O'Connor. There's Defense Department. This is relevant to Orwell. It was not always called that. It was once called the War Department. We changed that because they have a different task? No, because War Department sounds belligerent. It sounds like I engage in war. But it's the same. Defense sounds better than war. Veal sounds much better than what it is. Nobody goes to a restaurant. Well, tell me, what is veal a euphemism for?
Baby cow.
Baby cow. Or, may I engage in a dysphemism? Or is it a dysphemism to say tortured baby cow? You know what veal is or how it's prepared? You know what I'm talking about. If you don't, I guess you can look it up if you wish. Not before lunch. Maybe I'm engaging in a dysphemism here. Or maybe this is the accurate use of the term torture. Can a non-human animal be tortured? Or is that only applied to humans? Is it a legal term? Is it a moral term? Do you see the importance of context and the semantics here? Was the baby cow waterboarded? I'm sorry, forget that. The War on Terror. This was a great... Guess who came up with this one? I mentioned his name already. Frank Luntz. Again, incredible the influence this fellow has. The war in Iraq was not popular. It got more and more unpopular. As we discovered, it turns out Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and they played no role in what happened on the attack on 9/11. Turns out Saudi Arabia and those in Afghanistan had a lot more to do with it. In any case, it wasn't popular to call it the war in Iraq. It sounded like we were fighting the Iraqi people, when indeed we discovered that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction and were not connected to 9/11. We changed the goalpost and said the purpose of us being in Iraq is to free the Iraqi people. We changed the name of it, Operation Iraqi Freedom. The words we use makes a difference. Frank Luntz suggested not calling it the war in Iraq, but the war on terror. And that stuck. What's wrong with that phrase?
I've heard it talked about as like the war on terror, and especially the terror part being a signifier without a signified, so it doesn't have any real correspondent, like in reality.
Sense without a reference is another way of putting it.
Yeah.
That's a good way of, gotcha. Yeah.
And so we're not fighting terror because terror doesn't exist. We're just, it's really,
Yeah.
what would it be? It's rationalization, I guess, for...
Or a reification, if you want to be unnecessarily arrogant. To reify, the Latin term re means thing, to thingify. We need to have a war on poverty, a war on illiteracy, a war on drugs. I guess drugs are things. But that war that we waged since the 60s, that has not gone well. We're misapplying these militaristic terms where they don't seem to belong. And in this case, military probably plays a role against terrorists. That makes sense. But terror is not an object of battle. How do we win? When are we done? Is the war on terror over? I guess if terror is gone. But what is that we're referring to? To their credit, the Obama administration didn't like this phrase for the reasons we're speaking of. And they changed it. And they came up with their own euphemism. Overseas contingency operation. Which means, who knows? That's so vague as to be absolutely empty. And what's this?
I'm not.
A nut! It is a nut. How much would you pay for that?
10 cents.
10 cents. What if I told you the United States government paid over $2,000
You know why?
for each one? Do I know why?
Yeah, I have a cool anecdote that's kind of cool.
Let's hear it.
So, okay, I'm gonna leave out the classified bits, but.
Wait, what's that?
There's some classified stuff that I don't think I'm supposed to know.
Oh, wait a minute. How do you...
But anyway, I'll leave
Is
that?
that...
So
Okay.
I was talking with a contractor who did works on repairs of 9/11 on the Pentagon. And when, sorry for the sunglasses, I have a migraine.
Oh, sure. I thought this had to do with the classified information.
No.
I'm sorry.
And when he went in, he had to go in as the boss of the person he hired to do the concrete work.
Uh-huh.
And then with him, he had the person that hired him and 2 security guards and another person that led him around the building. So to do concrete work, they had like 5 or 6 people with them at all times.
And that's what made it cost more?
That's what makes it cost so much.
Ah, well, that's relevant. Similar to this. This is a little different, though. It has to do with definition and what we call things.
Those bolts are manufactured to like a stupid high caliber strength, or not accuracy. Which is why
And yet, instead of calling... And so, the accuracy and the clarification of it is instead of calling it a nut, because that's 10 cents or less, if we call it a hexaform rotatable surface compression unit, we can charge $2,000
yeah.
for each one. Now, it may be really precise, but I'll bet it ain't that precise.
No.
I think McDonnell Douglas was fleecing, is the term I think is used sometimes, the American government, the American taxpayer, that is us. And they got away with it up to a point, as John Morrell points this out, in a book on comedy, on humor, showing this is kind of funny and terrible. They're manipulating us with language. Does the language matter? It does. What you call things matter. What we want to do is avoid confusion in language. We're most interested in the cognitive sense of our meaning. Right? You can talk about an emotive meaning and a cognitive meaning. And as best we can, to go back to your earlier point, it's a good one. Can we avoid all emotion? No. But focus more on the cognitive. I can say this. Chris's entire wardrobe consists of very similar shirts. Now that could imply something. Although this is a bad day. This is actually not a similar shirt. This is a rare day that you're seeing a button-down shirt. So this is bad timing on this particular anecdote. The emotive meaning, notice we can distinguish these two and say, wait a minute, this one's different. Chris has the fashion sense of a lemming with no sense of fashion. It's truly an atrocity worse than what Hitler... That's ridiculous. But notice that's clearly different than that. This is better than this in this context. And a reminder to avoid the fallacy ad Nazium, please. Because that's exactly what the Nazis would have done. Use this kind of nonsense. And by the way, this is what he would wear on occasion. That's actually him. What the hell? He did a lot of things that were bad, see? In addition to... Okay, I mean, it's incredible. On we go. What are we looking at? We're looking at persuasion. And our problems in using persuasion. So Hitler uses his propaganda ministry to persuade. It's not convincing in Stebbing's sense of saying, this is true and here's why it's true. The language that Hitler used is still very, very common in our politics. And why? Because it works. Because something works doesn't mean it ought to be done. Right? Don't answer that. Just think about it. We want the latter. We want the convincing. You come to a class, you come to a lecture, you come to school to learn things, to be convinced that something is true or false. You go to a political rally to be persuaded, to continue following. You're not as interested in, I wonder if those statements that individual said up there on the podium are true. That's not what you're wondering. And in many cases, you've already been persuaded. So it matters the how and the what. I'm interested in both of these. And as I said, you can't avoid emotional language because you're emotional creatures. The worry is we have only emotion. There's another, who is asking this question, how can I tell? Right? How can I tell if somebody's bullshitting me? How can I tell if somebody is merely trying to persuade rather than convince? If all they have is emotive language and there's nothing underneath it, there's no attempt at an argument, or the argument is buried under flowery, lovely language, but it's a terrible argument, which is sometimes what happens. People are really good at using words, but have no arguments, no substance to it. That's why the analogy, a lightly snow-covered dung heap is still a pile of shit. I said shite there. I guess so. It doesn't sound like a cuss word. I don't know why I just said the word out here. It's written there. Do you see what I mean by that? Consider this, since we're discussing those historical matters. The desperate attempt by the Hawks and the Bush administration to link Saddam Hussein to Al-Qaeda only highlights the obvious fact that an invasion of Iraq has not the slightest relationship to the so-called war on terrorism. Now, this is a bit separated from the period, so it's less likely that we're going to have as many emotional attachments to this as we might have around 2005, for example, 2004. But if I am a member of the Bush administration or a fan of the Bush administration, I'm not going to like this. The language is going to piss me off, and I'm not going to listen to what might actually be underneath it. I'm just going to be enraged, and maybe justifiably so. And if I'm against the Bush administration, against that war, I'm also not going to think much about any of the underlying arguments. I'm just going to feel that drug fix of, yeah, get them. And they call them political junkies, and I mentioned this before. That's a term that's usually referred to drug addicts, a junkie. This is not coincidental. We have neurobiological data that shows when I am extreme right, extreme left, I get a reward. I get a fix in the same reward centers of my brain that I get when I have a drug fix, a physical injection of cocaine, whatever. When I hear my politician doing great, and more importantly, when the politician I distaste, that I loathe, is getting attacked, that reward center lights up. And this language pushes those buttons. There's another hint as to how you can tell. There's probably not really an argument underneath it. The problem here is that there may be good reasons, but we don't listen to them because we're caught up in the language. What are some words we would want to get rid of? Did you have a question?
Yeah. Wouldn't that also apply to like religion?
Which?
Like the junkie part about hearing, like if you go to like a pastor you're really passionate about, and you hear them preach, would that also carry over?
It could. It depends. That's a tough one. There is a class that addresses that. Really, there is. I mean, because that does.
Sure.
That I know. I should too. That's not a bad idea. I think, but no, that's a tough one. That requires a lot more, though, because what is in the philosophy of religion? Of course, there are arguments and there are emotion and passion. The two aren't always at odds. In fact, as Aristotle will tell us, and this will come back, to not have any emotion when you should, that's a failing. And maybe the case is with saving one's soul, ought to have passion behind it. But, as we'll see, it ought to have argument and reason too, especially if my beliefs affect my actions, which affect other people. There was another hand. Oh yeah, so the question about this.
Yeah, go to desperate.
Why add desperate? That seems unnecessary. Go ahead.
It just shows like they're obviously seeing one side of it, like they're very, like they stand on that side of it versus seeing both.
Very dichotomous in that way. Very good. Yes?
I know you should get rid of like obvious, but should you get rid of so-called?
Yes, you should. Remember why we get rid of obvious. If it's obvious, then you're wasting our time. Why state it? And if it's not obvious, and you need an argument, then why say obvious? So very good. And so-called is a downplayer. Where did you go to school? Oh, the so-called University of Phoenix. That's not really, it's not even in Phoenix. So that's right. That's when you put it in quotes. Yeah, he's a real genius. My daughter's just learning how to do scare quotes. She's not using them correctly yet, but it's quite fun. Yes, what's a hawk? Oh, was that yours?
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, using the word hawks show that they're basically predators.
That's right. Belligerent. And in the political sense, it's like pro-war. When you call somebody a hawk. But who's pro-war? Yay, war! No. Well, McDonnell Douglas, maybe. But that's going to be rare because they can. There are profiteers. There are war profiteers, yes. And there are people who profit off of abortion. And there are people who might say, if you have the chance, you should do abortion. Yay, abortion. But that's going to be the absolute tiny, and it's a straw man to say, well, that's this position. That party is pro-war. This party is overly pacifist, or doves. So it's a negative, it's a pejorative. And it only highlights, that again is a kind of negative. The obvious fact, talked about that, the invasion of Iraq has not the slightest relationship to the so-called war on terrorism. War on terrorism is itself confused, but that's not the issue here. We can rewrite all of that as that. This is less interesting, but it's clearly better than this in the sense of it's less emotionally laden and unnecessarily emotionally laden. It's a little bit more boring, but sometimes, yeah.
So, so you were saying we can't avoid using emotional words to describe. How do we know when to use them in a sense
very good.
to make your argument better?
That's right. That's not easy. The Holocaust was an atrocity. It's hard to come up with words that are too emotional to explain that. And that's just a sort of an extreme case, right? Horrible instances of child abuse. I don't think anyone is going to say, you're going a little too far with your adjectives there. There's not much worse than that. And so there it's applicable. However, you still might have to give reasons for why you're using that language. And I think it goes back to the earlier point. It's really hard to figure out what that middle ground is. And that's why it's beneficial to try to find a common ground with the person you're speaking with, your interlocutor. What is it you're trying to say? What is it you mean? Where do we find agreement? And then the verbal dispute can go away. Or at least there's the starting point of a philosophical discussion. And any emotionality is not seen as an attack. It's seen as it justly should be, a passionate but critical analysis of an issue. And the goal is to get your passions in line with your reasons, insofar as that's possible. That's an Aristotelian goal. Aristotle. The goal is to close that gap where our emotions actually are logically or aligned with what we can take logically to be the case. In my opinion, I already quoted this, in my opinion, it is not an unjustifiable assumption that whole phrase can simply be replaced with, I think. But why don't we use that? And I'll tell you why. It's because that sounds better. If I'm a consultant for a company, I don't want to come in using few words. I want to come in using lots of big words to make it seem like I'm smart. I have a language, a lexicon that you don't understand. That I deserve the money you're paying me because of my big words. And you damn well aren't going to question what I mean in public. You're less likely to raise your hand and say, I don't understand this. Because you don't want to look like a fool. And so what happens is people will use bigger words when diminutive ones will do just as well. That's a little joke on my part. Diminutive means small. Don't use diminutive unless, it works. There's an episode of Friends in which Joey, he's not very bright, wants to write a letter of recommendation for two other characters, and he gets a thesaurus. And online you can look up every word and it gives you a bunch of options. And it's amusing, the options that he comes up with. No need to do that. How to avoid confusion in language? Avoid ambiguity, because ambiguity is bad. And what does bad mean? Oh, at one point it meant good. And in some contexts it still does. I don't know if people still use that. How was that party? Oh, it was so bad. Meaning good? Yes. It could also mean not good. It could mean immoral. It could mean incorrect. It could mean improper. It could mean not functional. all of those, and maybe more, the term bad could mean. The context, of course, matters. The rules of the language game, if you want to use Wittgenstein's phraseology, that matters. But it's so easy because a lot of words have multiple distinct meanings. That's what ambiguous means. Multiple, clear, and distinct meanings. That's different than vagueness. Vagueness is a term that's along a spectrum. We'll see that next reading with Bertrand Russell. Ambiguous, notice, immoral and not functional are not the same thing at all. This car is bad. This shirt is bad. What does that mean? It was designed by, and it was put together by, small children who have no rights and work 30 hours a day. They really have no rules over there. Not even how long a day is. And then you've got other words that have multiple meanings. I'm not going to go through this now. But they're distinct. The whole point is, they're distinct. It's not a concern of vagueness, of cloudiness, of where to draw the line. The word right could be directional, could be political, could be geometrical. We're back to moral, correct. It could be a verbal crutch, right? Then there are homophones, right, and so on. Our concern is, how do we avoid this? And what happens when there's ambiguity in our arguments? There's the definition. A word or claim can be assigned more than a single meaning. And the context of our discussion or our argument does not help clarify which we mean. And there's two kinds of ambiguity, as we touched on already, semantic and syntactic. When we have a verbal dispute, it's probably because of ambiguity or vagueness. And if it's ambiguity, we want to figure out which kind. It'll give us a different kind of fallacy. The equivocation fallacy, as we'll see, is much more common insofar as arguments and errors in reasoning go. Amphibole is not that common. It's a term that Aristotle coins for us. And it's rare. Here's an example of equivocation, which is not uncommon. I think Orwell would not like me saying it's not uncommon. Too many negatives. Premise 1, only man is rational. Premise 2, no woman is a man. Assume they're both true. What follows? No woman is rational? Oh no. Must we follow the validity of the reasoning and conclude that women are not rational? Yes?
Well, wouldn't it be true that it is a valid argument? Because valid doesn't mean true.
Valid means truth-preserving. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. It does seem valid. Is it, though? It is if something. If what? Why can't we say it's valid? Yet. Yes?
Just not all the premises are true?
What? No, because validity isn't about actual truth value. Remember, it's if the premises were true, then they would necessitate the conclusion. It's sound if it's valid and all premises are true. But there's something confused here. In fact, we know it's equivocation. It's semantic ambiguity. Semantic means word meaning. What word has more than one meaning and is used without clarifying which meaning is being implied? In fact, it's using both meanings in the same argument and not telling us.
The word man and mankind.
Yes, exactly. Because man can be synonymous with humanity. And that's how it's being used in premise 1, presumably. Notice if you switch that, if you disambiguate it and say, only humans are rational, premise 2. No woman is a man. You wouldn't say no woman is a human. You'd say no woman is a man, therefore no woman is rational. That doesn't follow. But you only recognize that when you clarify, disambiguate, get rid of the confusion. Because the word man, we are equivocating on the word man. We're using man in two different senses, enabling us to sneak in a conclusion that doesn't follow. You see? There's a lot of other examples. I'm not going to go through all of these now. But here's an example. When I believe it or not, in San Diego, I saw the sign, not this sign, obviously. Tasted like chicken. That's probably a made-up sign. The dog found, and I got angry. I said to my wife, why do people who've lost their dog take the time to post signs and tell everyone, hey everyone, stop looking, I found my dog. And then she said to me, idiot, that's not what those signs mean. Do you see what happened though? I saw the sign that said found dog and implied and thought it meant the owners of the dog that had lost their dog found their dog and are putting up signs everywhere telling everyone, stop looking, we found our dog. For a moment, that's what I thought it meant. And it doesn't. But it could, do you see? Because it's ambiguous. Street signs are often ambiguous. Comedy uses ambiguity. This is amusing, but it's syntactically ambiguous. The anthropologist went to a remote area and took some photos of some native women, but they weren't developed. I conclude what from that? Probably you meant the pictures weren't developed, not the women. That would be odd. You see it in images, especially signs, where you can't have a little asterisk that says, slow children at play. And by slow, I mean you guys slow down in your cars. And by slow, I mean slow down to this speed. Because slow is ambiguous. Are they mentally slow, physically slow? Are you referring to me or the children? How slow do I go? That's vague. So it's vague and ambiguous. There's a motif here of the Bush administration. Here's a protest, lesbians against Bush. President Bush, I presume. That's all I'll say about that one. I'm not going to go through that, but that's purposeful ambiguity, where somebody's writing a letter of recommendation that they don't want to write, but didn't want to say no to them. There's ambiguity in each of these. I'll just give you the first one. I most enthusiastically recommend this candidate with no qualifications whatsoever. What does that mean? I don't know. Either the candidate has no qualifications, and they're terrible, or I recommend them, and my recommendation doesn't have any qualifications to it. It has two different meanings, and it's not clarified. And here are actual headlines that I have to imagine some people engaged with on purpose to be funny. But the less space you have to explain something, the easier it is for ambiguity to fall in. Prostitutes appeal to Pope. Probably it means they're asking him for something. Not the Pope is like, love prostitutes. And you have syntactic ambiguity here. Stolen painting found by tree. This phrase is unclear. Did the tree? That's ridiculous. Tree didn't find it. They were found next to the tree. And the hospitals were sued by 7-foot doctors. 7 podiatrists would make more sense. And this one, panda mating fails, veterinarian takes over. I'm not sure how to clarify that one. Just note how difficult being a veterinarian must be. Or how great if you really love pandas. Okay. You see what I'm saying there? So there are two kinds of ambiguity. We've already covered this. The semantic ambiguity has to do with word meaning, and semantic ambiguity gives us, if we're engaged in error and reasoning in an argument, the fallacy of equivocation. And that's more common insofar as ambiguity that's found in arguments. Syntactic ambiguity has to do with the structure. And this is less common, but we'll see an example that is politically and socially relevant, let's just say. So the sentence structure, we can fix it by adding punctuation or moving things around or adding an extra word for clarification. So that's grammar. And grammar is normally not a thing I concern myself with in your papers and such. But if your reasoning is flawed because of confusion, that has to be addressed, especially if it leads to one of the fallacies that we've discussed. I'm going to skip that. Consider this. Premise 1, all laws require a lawmaker. Premise 2, Galileo's principle of inertia is a law. Therefore, Galileo's principle of inertia requires a lawmaker. And you can go even further, and that lawmaker is who? Galileo? Okay. Or God. But here, I go with that. As you just said, did Galileo make the law of inertia? And the way that lawmakers can make the law of you're not allowed to tase bears, which they did. In Alaska, no, they weren't. And yet, the thought of the possibility of somebody tasing a bear, this is a long time ago, led to them coming up with a law, let's not allow this. And I bet somebody did after they were told, you can't do this. Oh, really? Guess what I'm doing this weekend? We're going to You're going to go cow tipping? No. Bear tasing this weekend. Anyway, this is Galileo telling the planets to stop moving. Well, that seems ridiculous. Of course, the argument can be used, and you'll see this argument in a class next semester, to prove the existence of God, but it's an equivocation.
I know we don't have that much time left, so sorry for the interruption, but I think it's possible to make the argument that it was Galileo that invented it, because...
That did what?
That Galileo that invented the law, or more specifically, that it's the subject that invents the law, because we're just seeing, like, cause and effect doesn't exist as an actual thing, right? We're just like kind of projecting it onto events as we see them in the world. So you could say that the law was invented, sort of, by his perception of it.
Sure. And therefore, he's the lawmaker. And is that analogous to how laws about people's interactions and seatbelts and so forth, are those similar? That would be an interesting argument by analogy, and maybe a paper. How about that? Okay, last few things here. I'm going to skip that. Although, notice, jackass. I'm sorry for this motif. It keeps coming back. This and my attack of Texas. If you drive a pickup truck, you're a jackass. Premise 2, if you're a jackass, then you're a male donkey. If you drive a pickup, you're a male donkey. That's a valid form of hypothetical syllogism, but as we can see here, I'm equivocating on the term jackass. Obvious example in that case. In fact, that's not a bad example to use. If you catch somebody equivocating, it doesn't hurt to have your own example to show, look, this is what I'm hearing you say, and then give them this form of reasoning. That's obviously ridiculous. Valid, but clearly unsound. And if you can show them their reasoning as this format, it shows that as a problem. Okay, where do I want to end here? Let's say a few more things. These are examples of amphiboly. Let me get to the argument here. If the patient says, my arm hurts in 2 places, and then the horrible doctor says you should not go to those places, that's amphiboly. That's silly, right? That's sentence structure. That's grammar. One thing I want to leave you with, another possible topic for a paper, is this, less silly. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. What in the world's going on there? Is that clear? Antonin Scalia says we should be able to look at the words, at the language, and determine what it means. Can you do that? That's what I want you to think about for next time. I am out of time. I'll return to this specific example at the beginning of class, and then we'll get into Bertrand Russell's paper on vagueness, which was actually a presentation he gave. Have an excellent, superlative day.